The waitress froze when she saw me. The champagne flute slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. Heads turned. One by one. Conversations stopped mid-laughter. Music faltered. My son's face went white, the kind of white that only appears when a ghost walks through the door. And maybe, to him, that's exactly what I was. His fiancée blinked, confused. She turned to him, smiling nervously. "Daniel, who is she?" And I said, in a voice that had buried every tear I ever cried, "I'm his mother." The microphone squealed. Someone gasped. I could feel the room tilt, joy curdling into shock. Because my son had told everyone I was dead. He'd written my obituary in words and lies, painted himself an orphan to win sympathy, to erase me from the world I brought him into. I stood there in the same dress I wore to his father's funeral, the same pearls he once said made me look like home. And now, surrounded by strangers who pitied the man who buried his living mother, I realized something cruelly poetic. Death didn't separate us, shame did. Before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back to the beginning. Because this story, my story, isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when the child you loved more than life kills you with lies. You need to understand something about me first. I wasn't always angry. I wasn't always this woman with fire in her voice and steel in her spine. No, I used to be soft. Gentle. The kind of mother who believed love could conquer anything, even silence. I was 68 years old, living in the same modest two-bedroom house where I'd raised Daniel alone after his father died when he was just 12. 43 years I'd been a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, 43 years of holding other people's pain, wiping their tears, telling them everything would be okay. And when I retired 2 years ago, I thought I'd finally have time. Time to read those books I'd been saving, time to tend my garden properly, time to watch my son become the man I'd always dreamed he could be. The house was quiet then, but it was a peaceful quiet. Harold's photograph still sat on the mantelpiece, right next to Daniel's graduation picture from law school. I'd dust them both every morning, talking to Harold like he was still there, telling him how proud we should be. "He's doing so well, honey," I'd whisper to that photograph. "Remember when he was 8 and said he wanted to help people? Well, he's helping people now. Big important people." Every Sunday, I'd call Daniel. Every Sunday, that phone would ring, and maybe 1 out of 4 times he'd answer. When he did, his voice was always rushed, always distracted. "Mom, I'm in a meeting." "Mom, can I call you back?" "Mom, it's not a good time." But I defended him. Oh God, how I defended him. When Mrs. Patterson next door would ask, "How's Daniel?" "Haven't seen him around lately," I'd smile and say, "He's busy with work." That's a good thing, isn't it? Means he's successful. When the mailman, Joe, would comment on how my son never seemed to visit, I'd laugh it off. You know how it is with young professionals. They work so hard. He calls though. Every Sunday he calls. I kept his childhood room exactly the same. The same blue plaid bedspread, the same baseball trophies on the shelves, the same posters of athletes he'd idolized. I'd vacuum in there once a week, dust the trophies, smooth the bedspread. Just in case. Just in case he decided to come home. The neighbors thought it was sweet. "Eleanor still keeps Daniel's room ready," they'd say. What a devoted mother. Devoted. That's what they called it. I called it hope. I'd make his favorite dinner sometimes, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the way his father used to love it, and I'd set 2 places at the table. One for me, one for the memory of him. I'd eat slowly, imagining what we'd talk about if he were there. I'd tell him about Mrs. Chen's new grandbaby, about how the roses were blooming better this year, about how proud his father would be. The silence in that house wasn't lonely then. It was expectant. Like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting for him to walk through that door and say, "Mom, I'm home." I should have known something was wrong when the calls stopped altogether. 3 weeks without hearing his voice. But I told myself he was probably working on a big case, probably too focused to remember to call his old mother. No news is good news, I'd tell Harold's photograph. He's just busy building his life. Then came that Tuesday afternoon in October. I was in my garden, deadheading the last of the autumn roses, when I heard Mrs. Patterson talking over the fence to Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street. Such a shame about Eleanor, Mrs. Patterson was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're being discreet but really aren't. What about Eleanor? Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Well, didn't you hear? Her son Daniel posted on that Facebook thing that she died last year. Some kind of heart attack, he said. Been telling everyone he's an orphan now, lost both parents young. Getting lots of sympathy from folks. My pruning shears slipped from my hands. But Eleanor's right there in her garden, Mrs. Rodriguez said, confused. I know. That's what makes it so strange. Maybe she doesn't know? Maybe she's getting, confused in her old age. Maybe she thinks she's still alive. I stood there among my roses, dirt under my fingernails, sun on my face, heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. And for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if they were right. If maybe I was confused, if maybe I had died and just hadn't realized it yet. But then a thorn from one of my roses caught my finger, and I bled. Real blood. Real pain. Real and alive and breathing. That's when the anger started. Not the explosive kind, not yet. The slow-burning kind. The kind that starts in your chest like indigestion and spreads through your whole body like poison. My son had killed me. With words, with lies, with the casual cruelty of someone who needed me gone more than he needed me alive. And I was still here, still breathing, still loving him, still keeping his goddamn room ready for a homecoming that would never come. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the phone. My hands were shaking, but not from age. From rage. From the kind of betrayal that cuts so deep you can feel it in your bones. I'd never had one of those Facebook accounts. What do I need that for? I'd always said, I have the people I need right here. But suddenly, I needed to see. I needed to know exactly how my son had buried me. It took me 3 tries to figure out how to make an account on Harold's old computer. My fingers fumbled over the keys, technology feeling foreign when your whole world has just shifted beneath your feet. But eventually I found it. Daniel Ashford, attorney at law. My son's page. And there it was. Posted 8 months ago. My own face staring back at me from the screen. It was my favorite photograph, the one from Christmas 2 years ago where I was smiling by the tree, wearing the red sweater Daniel had bought me. Except now it was surrounded by a black border, like a funeral announcement. Rest in peace, Mom. Gone too soon. The words hit me like a physical blow. I read them again and again and again until they burned themselves into my retinas. It's with a heavy heart that I share the passing of my mother, Eleanor Ashford. She died peacefully in her sleep after a sudden heart attack. She was the strongest woman I knew, and she raised me to be the man I am today. I'm grateful for every lesson she taught me, every sacrifice she made. She always told me to chase my dreams and never look back. I'll miss her every day, but I know she'd want me to keep moving forward. Thank you all for your kind words during this difficult time. Moving forward. Never look back. The comments made me sick. Hundreds of them. Colleagues, friends, people I'd never heard of, all expressing their sympathy for my poor, orphan son. So sorry for your loss, Daniel. Your mother sounds like an amazing woman. My heart goes out to you. Losing a parent is never easy. What a beautiful tribute. She raised a good man. You're so strong, Daniel. She'd be proud of how you're handling this. Each comment was a nail in my coffin, and I was very much alive to feel every single one. But it was the responses from Daniel that truly broke something inside me. Not broke it clean, that would have been merciful. No, they cracked it like ice on a pond, spiderweb fractures spreading through everything I thought I knew about my son. Thank you, everyone. Mom always said the measure of a life is in the love you leave behind. I'm trying to honor that by building something meaningful. She taught me that sometimes you have to let go of the past to embrace your future. I'm focusing on that now. Your support means everything to me. It's what gets me through the hard days. The hard days. What hard days? The days when he was lying about my death? The days when he was accepting sympathy for a loss he'd invented? The days when he was using my fictional grave as a stepping stone to whatever success he was chasing? I scrolled further back through his page, looking for any mention of me before my supposed death. Pictures of him at fancy restaurants, at charity galas, at professional conferences. Smiling with beautiful people, shaking hands with important-looking men in expensive suits. And in every single photo where someone had commented asking about his family, he'd been vague. Mysterious. Family's complicated. I prefer to focus on the future, not the past. Some stories are too personal to share. He'd been preparing for this. Preparing to erase me. Creating distance so that when he finally killed me off, no one would question it too closely. No one would say, "But didn't you just mention your mother last week?" I found a video from 6 months ago, some kind of professional interview. Daniel sitting in a crisp suit, talking about his success, his dedication, his drive. The interviewer had asked him about his background, his family. "I lost both my parents when I was young," he'd said, looking directly into the camera with the kind of earnest expression that makes people trust you immediately. "It taught me early that you can't rely on anyone but yourself. You have to be your own family, create your own support system." It made me stronger, more focused. I think adversity either destroys you or defines you, and I chose to let it define me. I watched that video 7 times. 7 times I watched my son tell the world that I was dead, that I had been dead for years, that losing me had made him stronger. 7 times I watched him turn my imaginary death into inspiration, into motivation, into a fucking origin story for his success. The rage wasn't slow burning anymore. It was a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. 43 years of bandaging wounds, of healing people, of believing in goodness, and all of it was ash now. Because the person I'd loved most in this world had decided I was worth more dead than alive. I picked up the phone to call him. My fingers dialed the number I knew by heart, the number I'd been calling every Sunday for years. It rang once, twice, then a message. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He'd changed his number. Of course he had. Can't have your dead mother calling you from beyond the grave. I tried his work number, the one I'd memorized from the few times I'd called his office. A pleasant receptionist answered. "Ashford and Associates, this is Jennifer." "Hi, I'd like to speak with Daniel Ashford, please." "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford is in court today. Can I take a message?" "This is his mother." The line went quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" "This is his mother, Eleanor Ashford. I need to speak with him." Another pause. "Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. Mr. Ashford's mother passed away last year. Is this regarding legal services?" "Legal services." As if I were a stranger calling for help with a will or a divorce. As if I weren't the woman who'd sat by his bedside when he had pneumonia at age 10, who'd worked double shifts to pay for his college, who'd cheered louder than anyone at his law school graduation. "No," I said quietly. "No, this isn't regarding legal services." I hung up the phone and sat in the silence of my kitchen, surrounded by the life I'd built, the memories I'd treasured, the love I'd poured into a son who had buried me alive. That night, I took down all the pictures of Daniel from the mantelpiece. Not in anger, not yet, but in a kind of numb, methodical way, like a nurse removing bandages from a wound that would never heal. I packed them away in a box, along with his report cards, his graduation photos, his childhood drawings that I'd saved for 30 years. As I closed the box, I found myself saying aloud, to the empty room, to Harold's photograph, to God or whoever might be listening, "He killed me. My own son killed me and used my death to make himself look good." The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and suffocating. I put the box in the hall closet, behind the winter coats I rarely wore anymore. Out of sight, but not thrown away. Because even in my rage, even in my pain, I couldn't bring myself to destroy the evidence of the love I'd given him. The love he'd decided was worthless. That was the night I understood that there are some betrayals that change you at a cellular level. That remake you from the inside out. That kill off the person you used to be and leave someone else wearing your skin. The Eleanor who had spent her life healing people was gone, buried in her son's lies. And rising from that grave was someone harder, someone angrier, someone who had nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything that mattered. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. Have you ever been a ghost haunting your own life? That's what it felt like. Moving through the world as a woman who was supposed to be dead, watching people react to my existence with confusion, pity, and growing suspicion. It started at church the following Sunday. I'd been going to St. Catherine's for 47 years. 47 years of sitting in the same pew, third row from the front on the left side. I knew every hymn by heart, had baked for every church fundraiser, had been there for every baptism, wedding, and funeral for nearly half a century. But when I walked in that Sunday morning, wearing my best navy dress and the pearl earrings Harold had given me for our anniversary, the whispers started immediately. Margaret Thompson, who'd been in my book club for 12 years, nudged her husband and pointed at me. I could read her lips. That's her. That's the one I told you about. Father Mackenzie, who'd given Daniel his first communion, who'd counseled me through Harold's death, who'd listened to me worry about my son's lack of visits. Father Mackenzie couldn't quite meet my eyes during his sermon. He kept glancing at me with this expression of concern mixed with confusion, like he was looking at someone he wasn't sure was really there. After service, I approached the group of women I'd considered my friends. Women I'd prayed with, laughed with, shared recipes and grandchildren's stories with, except I had no grandchildren's stories to share anymore, did I? My son was too busy being an orphan to give me grandchildren. Good morning, ladies, I said, my voice cheerful despite the ice in my chest. They exchanged glances. Patricia Winters, who'd been my closest friend at church, stepped forward with the kind of gentle smile you give to someone who's not quite right in the head. Eleanor, dear, how are you feeling? I'm feeling fine, Patricia. Why do you ask? More glances. Margaret cleared her throat. Well, it's just, we heard about your situation. My situation? With Daniel. With what he said about you. The words hung in the air like incense, thick and choking. I could see it in their faces. They thought I was crazy. They thought grief or age or some combination of both had broken my mind, made me forget that I was dead. I'm not dead, Patricia, I said quietly. As you can clearly see. Of course not, dear. Of course you're not. But maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Daniel was confused, or maybe someone else posted that announcement. You know how these computer things work. Anyone can pretend to be anyone. The kindness in her voice was almost worse than outright accusation would have been. She was trying to save my dignity, trying to give my son an excuse for what he'd done. Because surely a good Catholic boy like Daniel Wooden Ashford would never deliberately lie about his mother's death. There had to be some explanation, some mistake. There's no misunderstanding, I said. My son told the world I was dead because it was convenient for him. Because having a living mother apparently didn't fit the image he wanted to project. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing this, trying to reconcile the Daniel they remembered, the polite boy who'd helped serve at church dinners, who'd been an altar boy, who'd always said yes ma'am and no sir, with a man who would fake his mother's death. Margaret spoke first, her voice careful. Eleanor, that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? Misunderstanding. As if there were multiple ways to interpret rest in peace, Mom. Gone too soon. I'm sure, I said. I'm very sure. I left church that day knowing I'd never be welcome in the same way again. Oh, they'd still smile at me, still include me in their prayers, but there would always be that doubt in their eyes. That question, is she the crazy old woman who thinks her son faked her death, or is she the mother whose son actually did fake her death? And honestly, I wasn't sure which possibility made them more uncomfortable. The isolation spread like a disease. At the grocery store, where I'd shopped for decades, the cashiers started looking at me strangely. Mrs. Chin, who ran the corner market, asked me gently if I had family she could call. Someone to help you, Miss Eleanor. Someone to make sure you're okay. My neighbors stopped their friendly chats over the fence. When I worked in my garden, I could see them watching me through their windows, whispering to each other. The woman whose son said she was dead, working among her flowers like nothing had happened. Was it tragic or was it crazy? Was I to be pitied or feared? The worst part was the second-guessing that crept in during the dark hours of the night. Sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., eating cereal for dinner because cooking for one felt pointless, I'd wonder if they were right. If maybe I was confused, if maybe grief had broken something in my brain that I couldn't detect. I'd go to the mirror and touch my face, feeling the wrinkles, the soft skin, the realness of myself. I'd pinch my arm until it hurt, just to prove I could feel pain. I'd look at my reflection and say, my name is Eleanor Ashford. I am 68 years old. I am alive. My son told the world I was dead, but I am alive. Some nights I'd sit across from Harold's photograph and have conversations that felt more real than any interaction I'd had with living people in weeks. They think I'm crazy, Harold, I'd whisper to his smiling face. They think our son couldn't possibly have done this, so I must be the one who's broken. But you know, don't you? You know I'm not crazy. You know I raised a boy who grew up to bury his living mother for professional advancement. I'd imagine Harold's response, the way he'd furrow his brow when he was working through a difficult problem. What are you going to do about it, El? He'd ask, because that's what he always used to say when I came to him with troubles. Not, what should you do, but what are you going to do? Always assuming I had the strength to handle whatever life threw at me. I don't know yet, I'd tell his photograph. But I'm going to do something. Because he doesn't get to bury me and walk away. He doesn't get to use my death as inspiration while I'm still breathing. The anger was becoming something else now. Not just rage, but purpose. Not just hurt, but determination. Because I realized that every day I stayed hidden, every day I let the world think I was either dead or crazy, was another day my son got away with his lie. 3 weeks after I discovered my own obituary, I was sitting in my living room, trying to read a book, but finding the words swimming on the page when the doorbell rang. For a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe it was Daniel. Maybe he'd come to explain, to apologize, to somehow make this right. But when I opened the door, it was Dr. Matthews, my former physician, standing on my porch with an expression of professional concern. Eleanor, he said gently, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I heard some concerning things, and I wanted to check on you. Concerning things? About your mental state. About some confusion you might be experiencing regarding your son. I stared at him for a long moment, this man who'd been my doctor for 15 years, who'd helped me through Harold's death, who'd given me clean bills of health year after year. Now he was looking at me like I was a puzzle to be solved, a problem to be managed. Someone called you, I said. It wasn't a question. Patricia Winters was worried about you. She said you'd been making some unusual claims about Daniel, and she thought maybe you should be evaluated. Sometimes grief can manifest in unexpected ways, especially as we age. Grief. Age. The polite ways of saying crazy old woman who's lost her mind. Dr. Matthews, I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest, I am not confused. I am not suffering from dementia or grief-induced delusions. My son posted on social media that I died 8 months ago. He's been telling people he's an orphan. He's built his professional reputation partly on the sympathy he's received for losing his parents young. I am very much alive, as you can clearly see, and what my son has done is cruel and calculated. Dr. Matthews nodded in that way doctors do when they're humoring someone they think is unwell. Eleanor, I understand this must feel very real to you. But sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're feeling isolated or abandoned. Have you considered that maybe you misunderstood what you saw? Maybe there's been some kind of mix-up. A mix-up. As if accidentally posting your living mother's obituary was something that could just happen. As if building a career on fictional orphanhood was a simple misunderstanding. Would you like to see it? I asked. Would you like me to show you my son's Facebook page, where my face is surrounded by a black border and where hundreds of people have offered him sympathy for my death? For the first time, Dr. Matthews looked uncertain. Well, if you have something to show me, I suppose. I led him to Harold's computer, pulled up Daniel's page, and pointed to my own obituary. I watched Dr. Matthews' face as he read it, watched the confusion, and then the dawning realization cross his features. This is very strange, he said slowly. Eleanor, this does appear to be a memorial post for you. But surely there must be some explanation. There is an explanation, I said. The explanation is that my son decided he'd be more successful as an orphan than as a man with a living mother he rarely talked to. The explanation is that I raised a child who grew up to be someone I don't recognize. Dr. Matthews left that day with promises to look into the situation, to maybe reach out to Daniel himself to clear up the confusion. But I knew he wouldn't. Because the truth was too ugly, too unthinkable. It was easier to believe that a grieving widow had lost her mind than to accept that a successful young lawyer had faked his mother's death for personal gain. That night, I made a decision. I was done being the crazy woman, done being the confused old lady, done being the ghost haunting her own life. If my son wanted to play games with life and death, if he wanted to use my fictional grave as a stepping stone to success, then he was going to learn that some ghosts don't stay buried. I opened my closet and pulled out the dress I'd worn to Harold's funeral. Black, elegant, dignified. The dress of a woman who understood death intimately, who had stared it in the face and survived. I laid it out on my bed next to the pearl necklace Harold had given me on our wedding day. If Daniel wanted a dead mother, he was going to get one. But not in the way he expected. The plan came to me while I was dusting Harold's photograph, something I'd been doing obsessively since my world fell apart. It was a Saturday morning, and I was telling him about my week, about Dr. Matthews' visit, about the way people looked at me now. Like I was either crazy or pitiable, neither of which I had any intention of being. I need to show them all, I told Harold's smiling face. I need to show Daniel that you can't just bury someone and walk away. But how do I prove I'm alive to a world that's convinced I'm either dead or delusional? That's when I heard it. My neighbor's television through the thin walls, a morning news program talking about some charity gala, some fundraiser for the children's hospital. And the reporter mentioned a name that made my blood freeze, Daniel Ashford, one of the event's sponsors, one of the city's rising young philanthropists. I turned up my own television, catching the tail end of the story. There he was, my son, standing behind a podium, looking handsome and successful in an expensive suit, talking about giving back to the community, about how his tragic past had inspired him to help others. Losing both my parents at such a young age taught me the importance of creating family wherever you find it, he was saying, his voice smooth and practiced. These children in the hospital, they need advocates. They need people who understand what it's like to face uncertainty and loss. The reporter nodded sympathetically. And we understand you've recently gotten engaged? Congratulations. Daniel's face lit up with genuine happiness for the first time I'd seen in years. Thank you. Yes, I'm engaged to Victoria Pemberton. We're actually having our engagement party next week. It feels like everything is finally falling into place. Victoria Pemberton. The name hit me like a physical blow. Pemberton, as in Pemberton Industries, as in one of the wealthiest families in the state. Of course. Of course my son was marrying money, marrying status, marrying everything he thought he deserved. And of course, he couldn't have a living mother at that wedding. What would the Pembertons think of a woman who'd worked as a nurse for 43 years, who lived in a modest two-bedroom house, who didn't have the kind of pedigree that opened doors? Much better to be a tragic orphan who'd overcome adversity than a successful man whose mother was still alive and embarrassingly ordinary. The news story continued, the reporter mentioning that the engagement party would be held at the Pemberton estate, a lavish affair for 200 of the city's most influential people. Politicians, business leaders, society figures. All of them probably familiar with Daniel's inspiring story of orphan triumph. I turned off the television and sat in the silence of my living room, but it wasn't the peaceful silence I'd once enjoyed. It was the silence of a cemetery, the silence of a grave that was supposed to hold me but didn't. That's when the plan crystallized. Not revenge, that was too crude, too base for what I had in mind. This was going to be resurrection. A rising from the dead that would expose every lie, every manipulation, every cruel calculation my son had made. I spent the next few days researching. It turns out that when you're supposedly dead, it's remarkably easy to find information about events you shouldn't be able to attend. The engagement party was set for the following Saturday evening. Black tie, invitation only, with security provided by the city's most exclusive event planning company. But I had advantages Daniel didn't know about. 43 years as a nurse had given me connections throughout the city. I'd worked with caterers whose children I'd helped deliver, with event planners whose mothers I'd cared for in their final days, with security guards whose wives I'd comforted through miscarriages. One phone call to Margaret Sullivan, whose wedding I'd helped plan 15 years ago when she was a scared 19-year-old pregnant with her boss's baby. Margaret now ran the catering company that was handling the Pemberton engagement party. Eleanor. Margaret's voice was warm with genuine affection. It's been too long. How are you, honey? I'm well, Margaret. Listen, I need a favor, and it's going to sound strange. Anything for you. You know that. I took a deep breath. I need to get into the Pemberton engagement party next Saturday. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, Eleanor. That's a very exclusive event. The guest list was set months ago and security is. Margaret, I interrupted gently, my son is the one getting engaged. Daniel Ashford. Another pause, longer this time. But Eleanor, I thought. I mean, I heard that you weren't. That I was dead? I finished for her. Yes, I've heard that rumor too. Interesting how these things get started, isn't it? I could almost hear Margaret's mind working, trying to process this information. Eleanor, I don't understand. If Daniel is your son, why wouldn't you be invited to his engagement party? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. How do you explain to someone that your child has erased you from existence? How do you make them understand that love can be so thoroughly rejected that it becomes invisible? That's complicated, Margaret. But I promise you, I am very much alive, and I am very much Daniel's mother, and I have every right to be at my son's engagement party. I just need a way in. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, you know what? I don't need to understand the family dynamics. You helped me when I needed it most, and now I'm going to help you. I'll put you on the catering staff list. You'll be working the event, but you'll be inside. Thank you, Margaret. You have no idea what this means to me. Just promise me one thing, Eleanor. Whatever this is about, whatever happened between you and Daniel, promise me you're not going to do anything that gets me fired. I thought about that for a moment. Was I going to do anything that might get Margaret fired? Probably. Was I going to do anything that would hurt an innocent person who was helping me? No. The collateral damage from this truth-telling would fall squarely on the people who had created the lies in the first place. I promise you, Margaret, that my only intention is to remind some people of who I am. Nothing more, nothing less. The next few days were spent in preparation. I had one dress suitable for such an event, the black dress I'd worn to Harold's funeral. It was elegant, dignified, appropriate for a woman of my age and station. I paired it with the pearls Harold had given me, the ones Daniel used to say made me look like home. I practiced what I would say, how I would move, what expression I would wear. I studied recent photos of Daniel online, memorizing the shape of his face, the way he smiled for cameras, the way he carried himself. My son had become a stranger to me, but I was going to reacquaint myself with him very publicly. Friday night, I sat in my kitchen with Harold's photograph, eating a simple dinner of soup and bread. Tomorrow night, I would walk into my son's engagement party like Lazarus rising from the tomb. Tomorrow night, Daniel would have to explain to his fiancée, to her family, to all of his professional contacts, why his supposedly dead mother was standing in front of them very much alive. "I'm scared, Harold," I admitted to his photograph. "I'm scared of what I'm about to do, and I'm scared of what it's going to cost. But I can't let him get away with this. I can't let him build his whole life on the grave he dug for me." I imagined Harold's response, the way he'd always been able to calm my fears. "You're not doing this for revenge, Elle," I could almost hear him saying. "You're doing this for truth. And truth has a way of setting everyone free, even when it hurts." That night, I laid out my funeral dress, polished my good shoes, and prepared to attend my own resurrection. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel sharp and clear. I dressed carefully, deliberately, like a soldier preparing for battle. The black dress, Harold's pearls, my good shoes, my mother's small evening purse. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had been declared dead, who had been erased from her son's life, who was about to reclaim her existence in the most public way possible. Margaret had left detailed instructions. I was to arrive at the service entrance at 6:30, check in as Eleanor Morrison. She'd used my maiden name to avoid any questions, and I'd be working as part of the serving staff. Black dress, she'd said, would be perfect. I'd blend in with the other servers until the moment I chose not to. The Pemberton estate was even more intimidating than I'd imagined. Rolling lawns, elaborate gardens, a mansion that looked like something from a movie about how the other half lives. Cars that cost more than my annual income were lined up the curved driveway, dropping off guests who moved with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never doubting your place in the world. I checked in with the catering supervisor, a harried woman in her 40s who barely glanced at me as she handed me a serving tray and pointed toward the main reception area. Silver trays go to the guests, dirty glasses go to the kitchen, and stay invisible unless someone needs something. Stay invisible. The irony wasn't lost on me. The party was everything I'd expected and nothing I could have prepared for. The main ballroom was lit by crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my house. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos clustered around elaborate floral arrangements, sipping champagne that I was sure cost more per bottle than I'd spent on groceries in a month. And there, in the center of it all, was my son. Daniel looked magnificent. There's no other word for it. He'd grown into his features in a way that made him genuinely handsome, confident in the way that success and money can make a person confident. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, his hair styled in a way that looked casual, but probably cost a fortune to achieve. He moved through the crowd like he belonged there, like he'd been born to this life. Next to him was Victoria Pemberton, and I had to admit she was beautiful. Tall, elegant, with the kind of blonde hair that looked natural, but definitely wasn't, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car. She gazed at Daniel with obvious adoration, her hand resting possessively on his arm as he introduced her to various guests. I stayed in the background for the first hour, circulating with my tray of champagne, watching, listening, preparing. The conversations were exactly what I'd expected, business deals disguised as social chat, political maneuvering wrapped in pleasantries. The kind of networking that gets disguised as friendship among people who measure their worth in bank accounts and social connections. But what struck me most was how natural Daniel looked in this environment. This wasn't a boy from a working-class family pretending to be something he wasn't. This was a man who had transformed himself so completely that he genuinely belonged here. The transformation was so thorough that I almost didn't recognize him as the child I'd raised. I heard fragments of conversations as I moved through the crowd. Daniel's such an inspiration. Lost both parents so young, but look at him now. Victoria's so lucky. A man who's overcome that kind of tragedy, he really understands what's important in life. Did you hear his speech at the Children's Hospital fundraiser? About how losing his family taught him to create family wherever he found it. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. Each comment was like a small knife, twisting in the wound my son had created. He wasn't just using my death as a conversation starter, he'd turned it into his whole persona. The tragic orphan who'd triumphed over adversity. The self-made man who'd learned to rely only on himself. Around 8 o'clock, Victoria's father, Robert Pemberton, called for attention. The crowd gathered as he moved to a small platform at the front of the room, champagne glass raised. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate my daughter Victoria and her fiancé Daniel. It's not often we see such a perfect match, two people who complement each other so beautifully, who bring out the best in each other. Applause. Smiles. The warm glow of people who believe they're witnessing true love. Daniel, Robert continued, I have to say, when Victoria first brought you home, I was impressed not just by your success, but by your character. The way you've built your life from nothing, the way you've turned personal tragedy into strength and compassion, that tells me everything I need to know about the man my daughter is marrying. More applause. Daniel looked appropriately humble, the perfect picture of a man who'd earned everything through hard work and determination. And Victoria, Robert turned to his daughter, you've found yourself a man who understands that family isn't just about blood, it's about the people you choose to love, the people who choose to love you back. Daniel may not have his original family anymore, but he's gaining a big one tonight. That's when I moved. I had been standing near the back of the crowd, just another server holding a tray of empty glasses. But Robert Pemberton's words about family, about Daniel not having his original family anymore, about the people who choose to love you, those words broke something open in me that had been building pressure for weeks. I set down my tray and started walking toward the front of the room. Not quickly, not dramatically, just walking. A woman in a black dress moving through a crowd of people who had no idea they were about to witness a resurrection. I was about halfway to the front when Jennifer Morrison, one of the servers I'd worked with at the hospital years ago, recognized me. Her tray slipped from her hands. The crash of crystal hitting marble was like a gunshot in the elegant ballroom. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The kind of silence that spreads like ripples in a pond, growing outward until the entire room was holding its breath. And that's when Daniel saw me. I watched his face change, watched the confident smile fade into confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been terror. The color drained from his skin so completely that for a moment I thought he might faint. Victoria, still standing next to him, followed his gaze to me. She looked confused, glancing between Daniel and me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Daniel, she said softly, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet. Who is she? The question hung in the air like incense, thick and suffocating. Every eye in the room was on me now, this woman in black who had somehow disrupted their perfect evening just by existing. I took another step forward, then another, until I was standing directly in front of the platform where my son stood frozen like a statue. And in a voice that had buried every tear I'd ever cried, in a voice that carried 43 years of healing people and 8 months of being erased by the person I'd loved most, I said, I'm his mother. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was a complete absence of sound, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. 200 of the city's most important people, people who were never at a loss for words, stood frozen in a moment that none of them understood, but all of them felt. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the absolute stillness. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I looked directly at her, this beautiful young woman who thought she was marrying a tragic orphan, who had no idea she was engaged to a man who could erase his own mother from existence. I said I'm his mother. Daniel's mother. Eleanor Ashford. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, a dawning horror as she began to process what this meant. She turned to Daniel, who was still standing there like a man who'd seen his own ghost. "Daniel," she said, her voice gaining strength, gaining an edge of demand. "You told me your mother died when you were young. You said both your parents died in a car accident." The lie hung in the air between them like a physical thing. I could see Daniel's mind working, could almost hear the wheels turning as he tried to figure out how to explain this away, how to spin this into something that wouldn't destroy everything he'd built. "Victoria, I can explain," he started, but his voice cracked on the words. "Explain what?" Robert Pemberton's voice cut through Daniel's stammering. Victoria's father had stepped forward, his face set in the kind of expression that had built business empires and destroyed enemies. "Explain how your dead mother is standing in my living room very much alive?" The crowd was pressing closer now, no longer pretending not to listen. Phones were appearing in hands, cameras focusing on the scene unfolding before them. Whatever happened next was going to be recorded, shared, dissected by everyone who witnessed it. Daniel tried to laugh, a sound that came out broken and desperate. This is clearly some kind of mistake. Some confused woman." "Confused?" The word came out of me like a slap. "Confused, Daniel? Am I confused about giving birth to you? Am I confused about sitting by your bedside when you had pneumonia at 10 years old? Am I confused about working double shifts to pay for your college education? Am I confused about the phone calls you stopped returning, the visits you stopped making, the way you slowly erased me from your life until you could finally declare me dead?" With each word, I could see Daniel shrinking. The confident, successful man who had commanded this room's attention was becoming the scared little boy I remembered, the one who used to hide behind my skirt when strangers talked to him. "Daniel," Victoria's voice was deadly quiet now. "Is this woman your mother?" The question was simple, direct, impossible to evade. And in that moment, I saw my son make a choice. I saw him look at me, look at Victoria, look at the life he'd built on my fictional grave, and decide that his lies were more valuable than my truth. "No," he said, his voice gaining strength from his commitment to the deception. "No, I've never seen this woman before in my life. My mother died 8 years ago. This is obviously someone who's confused, maybe someone with mental health issues." "Liar." The word came from behind me, from someone in the crowd. I turned to see an older man pushing forward, someone I didn't recognize, but who was clearly recognizing me. "I know you," he said, pointing at me. "You're Eleanor Ashford. You worked at St. Mary's Hospital for decades." "I know, because you helped deliver my daughter 25 years ago." A murmur went through the crowd as other people began to focus on me more carefully, began to process not just that I was claiming to be Daniel's mother, but that I was a real person with a real history in this city. "And I know you too," the man continued, turning to Daniel. "You're the lawyer who spoke at the Rotary Club last month about overcoming family tragedy. You told us your parents died when you were 19, said it taught you to be self-reliant." The walls were closing in around Daniel's lie, but he wasn't giving up. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this woman is clearly disturbed. My mother died 8 years ago, and whoever this is, whatever she's going through, this isn't the place." I opened my purse. Inside was a manila envelope I'd brought, containing photographs, documents, proof of the life I'd shared with my son. With trembling hands that somehow felt steadier than they had in months, I pulled out the first photograph. This is Daniel's 8th birthday party, I said, holding up the picture so the crowd could see. In our backyard. He's wearing the Superman costume I made for him because we couldn't afford to buy one. I heard someone gasp. In the photo, Daniel was clearly recognizable, even at 8 years old. The same eyes, the same smile, the same facial structure that had simply matured into the handsome man standing frozen on the platform. I pulled out another photo. This is his high school graduation. That's me standing next to him in the blue dress. That's his father's watch he's wearing. Harold gave it to him that day, said he was proud to see his son become a man. More murmurs from the crowd. The photos were passing from hand to hand now, evidence of a life shared, of a son and mother who had existed together in ways that couldn't be faked or explained away. This is his law school graduation, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each piece of evidence. I'm the woman in the purple dress standing behind him. I saved for 3 years to afford the trip, took vacation time from the hospital so I could watch my son graduate. I was so proud that day. So proud of what he'd accomplished. Victoria grabbed the photographs from the nearest person, studying them with the intensity of someone whose entire world was shifting beneath her feet. I could see her recognizing Daniel in each image, seeing the clear family resemblance between us, understanding that these weren't random pictures, but documentation of a real relationship. Daniel, she said, her voice barely controlled. These photos, this is clearly you. This woman, she's clearly your mother. How is this possible if she's been dead for 8 years? Daniel looked at the photos, looked at me, looked at the crowd of people who were now staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation. Those photos could be doctored. People can fake anything these days with computers. Oh, for God's sake, Daniel. The voice belonged to Margaret Sullivan, who had pushed through the crowd and was now standing near the front. Stop lying. I've known Eleanor Ashford for 15 years. She helped plan my wedding, held my hand when I was scared and pregnant and alone. She's one of the kindest, most honest women I've ever known, and she is absolutely your mother. The crowd was turning now. I could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way a group of people moves from confusion to understanding to judgment. These were successful, intelligent people who were beginning to realize they'd been lied to systematically and deliberately. Robert Pemberton stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. Mr. Ashford, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from never being questioned. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Is this woman your mother? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could see Daniel weighing his options, calculating the cost of truth versus the cost of continued lies. And in that moment, I saw him make the same choice he'd been making for months. He chose his fiction over my reality. No, he said, but his voice was weaker now, less convincing. This woman is not my mother. My mother died 8 years ago, and I don't know what this person wants, but... I pulled out the last item from my envelope. Daniel's birth certificate. Original, official, with his tiny footprints and my signature as his mother. This is your birth certificate, Daniel. With my name on it. Eleanor Marie Ashford, mother. Would you like me to read the time of birth? 7:43 in the morning, after 18 hours of labor. Would you like me to tell these people about the complications that nearly killed us both? About how you came out not breathing, and they had to work on you for 3 minutes before you cried. The birth certificate was making its way through the crowd now, passed from hand to hand like evidence in a trial. Which, I realized, is exactly what this had become. A trial in which my son was both the defendant and the primary witness against himself. Victoria was holding the birth certificate now, staring at it with the expression of someone who had just realized her entire relationship was built on lies. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost couldn't hear it. Daniel, this is your birth certificate. This woman is listed as your mother. This is legal documentation. Daniel looked at the paper in her hands like it was a venomous snake. That could be forged. Anyone can forge documents. But the fight was going out of him now. I could see it in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his eyes couldn't quite meet mine anymore. The weight of maintaining such a massive lie in front of so many people was finally crushing him. Forged? I asked, my voice sharp with all the anger I'd been carrying for months. Like the memorial post you made for me? Like the interviews where you talked about losing your parents young? Like the sympathy you've been collecting for 8 months for a tragedy that never happened? The crowd was completely focused on us now, the entire party forgotten in favor of this real-life drama unfolding before them. I could see people recording with their phones, could imagine the videos already being uploaded, the story already spreading beyond this room. Robert Pemberton looked at Daniel with a kind of disgust usually reserved for something you'd scrape off your shoe. Mr. Ashford, I've built my business on being able to read people, and right now I'm reading a young man who has lied to my daughter, to me, to this entire community about something as basic as whether his own mother is alive or dead. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to commanding rooms full of important people. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've seen enough. Whatever Mr. Ashford's motivations were for this deception, he clearly felt that having a living mother was somehow incompatible with the image he wanted to project. I find that not just dishonest, but fundamentally disturbing. Daniel was looking around the room now like a trapped animal, seeing nothing but judgment and disgust in every face. These people who had admired him, who had seen him as an inspiration, who had respected his story of triumph over tragedy, they were all looking at him like he was something broken and distasteful. Victoria, he said, reaching for her hand. Please, let me explain. I can explain this. She pulled away from him like his touch burned her. Explain what, Daniel? Explain how you told me your mother was dead when she's standing right there? Explain how you built our entire relationship on a lie? Explain how you let me fall in love with someone who doesn't even exist. The pain in her voice was almost as sharp as my own. Because Victoria was another victim of Daniel's lies, another person whose trust he'd manipulated for his own benefit. The engagement is off, Robert Pemberton announced to the room, his voice cutting through any remaining murmur of conversation. Obviously. And Mr. Ashford, I think it would be best if you left. Now. Daniel looked around the room one more time, seeing nothing but faces turned away from him, people who couldn't even bear to look at him anymore. When his eyes finally met mine, I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before: shame. Real, crushing shame. Mom, he said, his voice breaking on the word. Don't, I said quietly. Don't call me that. Not here. Not now. Not after what you've done. He stood there for another moment, this man who had killed me with lies, who had built his success on my fictional grave, who had just lost everything because the truth is harder to bury than the living. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind 200 witnesses to his deception and a mother who was finally, completely, irreversibly alive again. The days after the engagement party were like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Everything Daniel had built, his reputation, his relationships, his carefully crafted image, came crashing down with the methodical inevitability of gravity. By Sunday morning, the videos were everywhere. Someone had captured the entire confrontation on their phone, and it had been shared thousands of times across every social media platform. Dead mother crashes son's engagement party was trending on Twitter. The local news stations picked it up by Sunday evening, and by Monday morning, it had gone national. I watched the coverage from my kitchen table, sitting across from Harold's photograph like I had so many mornings before, except now the silence felt different. Not empty, but expectant. Like the world was finally ready to hear my voice. Good morning. I'm Sarah Chin with Channel 7 News, and we're following up on a story that has captivated the internet over the weekend. A local attorney's engagement party was dramatically interrupted when his supposedly deceased mother appeared very much alive. They showed clips from the party, showed Daniel's face as he realized his lies were crumbling, showed Victoria's expression as she understood the depth of his deception. They showed me, standing in my black dress with Harold's pearls, holding up photographs of the son who had erased me from existence. The phone started ringing Monday morning and didn't stop. Reporters, old friends from the hospital, former patients, neighbors. Everyone wanted to know the story, wanted to understand how a son could declare his living mother dead. But I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready to speak to the world until I understood what speaking would cost me. By Tuesday, Daniel's law firm had released a statement. Ashford and Associates is conducting a thorough review of recent allegations regarding Mr. Daniel Ashford. We take matters of professional integrity very seriously and will respond appropriately once our investigation is complete. Corporate speak for, we're figuring out how to fire him without getting sued. Wednesday brought news that the Pemberton family had formally announced the end of the engagement. Recent events have made it clear that the relationship was based on fundamental misrepresentations that are incompatible with our family's values. More corporate speak, but this time with the kind of finality that comes from having serious money. Victoria would be fine. She was young, beautiful, and rich enough to recover from this humiliation. Daniel, on the other hand, was learning what it cost to lie to people who had the power to destroy your career with a few phone calls. Thursday morning, I found him on my front porch. He looked like he'd aged 10 years and 5 days. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept since his world collapsed. But what struck me most was how small he looked. This man who had commanded rooms full of important people, who had carried himself with such confidence and authority, was sitting on my porch steps looking like the scared little boy I remembered. "Mom," he said when he saw me through the screen door. "Please, can we talk?" I stood there looking at him through the mesh screen, this barrier between us that felt both insignificant and insurmountable. Part of me wanted to open the door, to let him in, to hold him like I had when he was small and scared. But that part of me had been buried under 8 months of lies and public humiliation. "What would you like to talk about, Daniel?" "I need to explain. I need you to understand why I did what I did." "Oh, I understand perfectly. You needed me dead so you could build the life you wanted. You needed to be an orphan so people would see you as inspiring instead of ordinary. You needed my grave to stand on so you could reach the heights you thought you deserved." He flinched like I'd hit him. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't that calculated." "Then tell me what it was like." He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. It started small. At networking events, professional mixers. People would ask about my background, my family. And when I'd mention that my mother was a nurse who lived in a modest house across town, I could see it in their faces. The dismissal. The way they'd categorize me as someone who wasn't really their caliber. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "So you were ashamed of me?" No, Mom, it wasn't shame. It was strategy. I thought if I could just not mention you for a while, let people get to know me first, then later I could introduce you and it wouldn't matter as much. But it escalated. It escalated, he admitted. People started assuming things about my background based on how I carried myself, where I went to school, how I spoke. And I didn't correct them. I let them think I came from their world. And then someone asked directly about my parents. At a charity dinner where I was trying to make connections, trying to build my practice. And I panicked. I said they had died when I was young. Just said it without thinking. I listened to him explain how one lie had led to another, how the story of his tragic orphanhood had grown and evolved until it became central to his identity. How the sympathy and admiration he'd received had felt so good, so validating, that he'd kept building on it. And posting my obituary? Was that panic too? He was crying now, tears streaming down his face like he was 8 years old again. I was getting serious with Victoria. Her family was asking questions about my background, wanting to meet my family. I knew I couldn't keep lying forever, but I also knew that telling the truth would destroy everything I'd built. So I thought if I made it official, if I posted that you had died, then the questions would stop. People would stop asking to meet you. And you never thought about what that would do to me? I told myself you'd never find out. You don't use social media, you don't move in those circles. I thought I could live in both worlds, be successful in my professional life, and still be your son in private. The naivety of it was breathtaking. The idea that he could commit such a fundamental betrayal and somehow keep it compartmentalized, keep it from affecting our relationship. But I did find out. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry, Mom. I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed you. But I need you to understand that I never meant for it to go this far. I looked at him through the screen door, this man who had been my whole world for so many years, who I had loved with the kind of fierce, protective love that mothers feel for their children. And I felt nothing. Not love, not hate, just a vast emptiness where my feelings for him used to live. The firm fired me. He continued when I didn't respond. The partnership vote that was supposed to happen next month has been indefinitely postponed. 3 major clients have already dropped me. The Bar Association is opening an ethics investigation. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Are you really sorry, or are you glad to see me suffer? The question hung between us like a blade. Was I glad to see him suffer? Was this elaborate public humiliation what I had wanted when I walked into that engagement party? I'm not glad to see you suffer, Daniel. But I'm not sorry that your lies have consequences. I'm not sorry that people know who you really are now. Who I really am. Mom, this isn't who I really am. This is who I became when I got scared and made bad choices. The real me is the son who loves you, who's grateful for everything you've done for me. The real you declared me dead for 8 months. The real you accepted sympathy and admiration for a tragedy you invented. The real you let your fiancé fall in love with a fiction. I can fix this. I can make it right. I can tell everyone the truth, explain what happened. The truth? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is that you're exactly the kind of person who would fake his mother's death for professional advancement. The truth is that when you had to choose between your career and your mother, you chose your career. The truth is that you're capable of a level of betrayal that most people can't even imagine. He was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Please, Mom. Please don't give up on me. I know I fucked up. I know I hurt you. But I'm still your son. I'm still the little boy who used to crawl into your bed during thunderstorms. And that's when I felt it. Not love, not forgiveness, but something harder and more final. Clarity. No, I said quietly. You're not. That little boy would never have done what you've done. That little boy grew up and became someone I don't recognize, someone I don't particularly like. Mom. My name is Eleanor. Eleanor Ashford. The woman whose obituary you posted, whose death you've been mourning publicly for 8 months. If you want to continue that fiction, that's your choice. But you don't get to call me Mom anymore. I turned away from the door, leaving him sobbing on my porch. Through the window, I watched him sit there for another 20 minutes, crying like his heart was breaking. Maybe it was. But hearts can be mended. Trust, once broken as completely as he'd broken mine, doesn't heal. When he finally left, driving away in the expensive car he'd bought with money from clients who'd hired him partly because they felt sorry for the orphan lawyer, I sat down at my kitchen table across from Harold's photograph. I think that's the end of it, I told Harold's smiling face. I think that's as much justice as I'm going to get. But I was wrong. The story wasn't over yet. The reporters finally stopped calling after about 2 weeks. The story had run its course, been replaced by newer scandals and fresher outrages. But the aftermath lingered in ways I hadn't expected. The first surprise came from Margaret Sullivan, who showed up at my door 3 days after Daniel's visit with a casserole and a proposition. "Eleanor," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there, "I've been thinking about what you did at that party. Not just confronting Daniel, but the way you handled yourself. The dignity you showed under impossible circumstances." "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure where this was leading. "I think you should write a book." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. A book? About what happened? About being a mother whose son declared her dead. About surviving that kind of betrayal. About finding the strength to reclaim your own existence. The idea seemed absurd. "Margaret, I'm a retired nurse. I don't write books. You don't have to be a writer to have a story worth telling. And your story. Eleanor, do you know how many people have reached out to me since the news coverage? People who've been cut off from their children for lesser reasons. People who've been erased from their children's lives in different ways. What you went through, what you survived, it's not as uncommon as you'd think." Over the following weeks, I discovered she was right. Letters started arriving, emails forwarded through Margaret and other friends. Stories from parents whose successful children had grown ashamed of their humble backgrounds, from mothers and fathers who'd been slowly edited out of their children's lives as those children climbed social and professional ladders. One letter came from a woman in California whose daughter, now a prominent surgeon, had told her medical school classmates that her parents were dead rather than admit her mother cleaned houses for a living. Another from a father in Texas whose son had moved to New York and told his Wall Street colleagues that he'd grown up in Connecticut wealth rather than acknowledge his father's job as a mechanic. The stories poured in, dozens of them, and I realized that what Daniel had done to me wasn't unique. It was just the most extreme version of a phenomenon that happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. Children who loved their parents in private but were ashamed of them in public. Reading those letters, I understood that my story wasn't just about Daniel and me. It was about the cost of social climbing, about the price of reinvention, about what happens when love collides with ambition and ambition wins. I started writing in December, sitting at my kitchen table with Harold's photograph watching over me. Not a book, just thoughts, memories. An attempt to understand how the little boy who used to make me Mother's Day cards had grown into a man who could erase me so completely. The writing helped. It gave me a way to process not just the anger, but the grief. Because I was grieving not just the relationship I'd lost with Daniel, but the person I'd thought he was. The son I'd raised existed only in my memories now. The man he'd become was a stranger. Spring arrived early that year, and I threw myself into my garden with an intensity one hadn't felt in years. I planted new roses where the old ones had died, cleared out the flower beds that had been neglected during the worst of my pain, created something beautiful from dirt and seeds and determination. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, started coming over for coffee again. The awkwardness of the past year gradually faded as it became clear that I was neither dead nor crazy, just a woman whose son had done something unthinkable. "I have to ask," she said one morning in April, watching me through the kitchen window as I worked in my garden. "Do you ever think about forgiving him?" It was a question I'd been asking myself for months. Forgiveness was supposed to be healing, supposed to free you from the burden of anger. But forgiveness required something from the other person too, acknowledgement, remorse, some attempt to make amends. "He's never asked for forgiveness," I said. "He's asked me to understand, to excuse, to overlook. But he's never actually asked me to forgive him. And I think that tells me everything I need to know about whether he truly understands what he did wrong. What if he did ask?" I thought about that for a long time. I don't know. The person who could do what Daniel did. I'm not sure that person is capable of the kind of genuine remorse that would make forgiveness meaningful. By summer, I'd finished what had become a book after all. 200 pages about love and betrayal, about the difference between making mistakes and making choices, about what it means to be erased by the person you'd sacrifice everything for. Margaret helped me find a publisher, a small house that specialized in memoirs and personal narratives. They were excited about the story, said it touched on themes that were increasingly relevant in our social media age, the pressure to curate your life, to present only the most palatable version of yourself to the world. The thing about your story, the editor told me during our first meeting, is that it's not really about social media or professional networking or any of the modern elements. It's about something much older and more fundamental, the tension between who we are and who we want to be, and what happens when that tension becomes more important than the people who love us. The book came out the following spring, almost exactly 2 years after that terrible Sunday when I discovered my own obituary. I did interviews, appeared on morning shows, spoke at bookstores and libraries. The response was overwhelming, not just from other parents who'd experienced similar betrayals, but from adult children who recognized themselves in Daniel's story and wanted to understand how they could avoid repeating his mistakes. One interview, on a national morning show, stands out in my memory. The host was a woman about Daniel's age, polished and professional, who had clearly done her research. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "your son's actions seem almost incomprehensibly cruel. How do you make sense of what he did?" I'd been asked this question dozens of times by then, and my answer had evolved with my understanding. I think Daniel became so focused on who he wanted to be that he lost sight of who he actually was, I said. He got caught up in the idea that his background was something to overcome rather than something to honor. And once you start seeing your family as an obstacle to your success rather than the foundation of your identity, it becomes easier to make the kinds of choices that would have been unthinkable before. Do you think social media played a role in this? Social media made it easier for him to create and maintain the fiction, but the impulse was older than that. It was about shame. About believing that love isn't enough if it comes from the wrong kind of people, in the wrong kind of package. And have you heard from him since the engagement party? This was always the question that hurt the most to answer. No, not since that morning when he came to my house asking me to understand why he'd done what he'd done. I think he's moved away, started over somewhere else. Which is probably for the best. Do you miss him? The question caught me off guard, even though I should have expected it. I miss the child he used to be. I miss the relationship I thought we had. But the man who faked my death? No, I don't miss him. How can you miss someone who was never really there? After the interview, driving home through the suburban streets where I'd raised Daniel, I found myself thinking about that question more deeply. Did I miss him? The honest answer was more complicated than what I'd said on television. I missed having a son. I missed having someone to call on Sundays, someone to worry about, someone to be proud of. I missed the future I'd imagined for us, holidays together, maybe grandchildren someday, the continuation of our family story. But Daniel himself? The man who could erase me so completely and live with it for 8 months? I didn't miss him because I was finally beginning to understand that I'd never really known him at all. That realization should have been devastating. Instead, it was oddly liberating. Because it meant that what I'd lost wasn't real love, it was the illusion of love, the fiction of a relationship that had existed more in my imagination than in reality. Real love, I was learning, required seeing people as they actually were, not as you hoped they could be. And the truth was that Daniel had been showing me who he was for years in the missed calls, the canceled visits, the growing distance between us. I just hadn't wanted to see it. By the second anniversary of the engagement party, I'd found something I hadn't expected: peace. Not the peace of forgiveness or reconciliation, but the peace of acceptance. Acceptance that some relationships end not because of what happens, but because of what's revealed. Acceptance that love alone isn't always enough to bridge the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. I was working in my garden that evening, deadheading the roses that had grown so beautifully over the past 2 years, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. For just a moment, my heart leaped with the old hope. Maybe it was Daniel. Maybe he'd finally come to truly apologize. Maybe we could find our way back to each other. But when I looked up, it was just Margaret, coming by with dinner as she did most Sunday evenings now. We'd grown closer over the past 2 years, bonded by the strange circumstances that had brought us back into each other's lives. "How are the roses this year?" she asked, joining me in the garden. "Better than ever," I said, and I meant it. The garden I'd created from the ashes of my old life was thriving in ways the old one never had. Stronger, more resilient, more beautiful for having survived the worst of winters. We stood there together as the sun set behind the house where I'd raised a son who no longer existed, at least not in the form I'd once known him. And for the first time in years, the silence felt complete. Not empty, not expectant, but full. Full of possibility, full of the life I was still living, full of the knowledge that sometimes the most profound act of love is letting go. That night, I sat at my kitchen table one last time with Harold's photograph, but instead of talking to him about Daniel, I talked about the future. About the book tour that was taking me to 12 cities over the next 3 months. About the documentary crew that wanted to film my story. About the foundation I was starting to help other parents who'd been cut off from their children. "I think you'd be proud of what I've built from this mess," I told Harold's smiling face. "I think you'd like the woman I've become." And in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by the life I'd reclaimed and the future I was creating, I could almost hear his voice. "I've always been proud of you, Elle. Always." The ghost who had walked into Daniel's party that night 2 years ago had been resurrected not just as a mother reclaiming her existence, but as a woman discovering who she could become when she stopped defining herself entirely through her relationship with her son. It wasn't the ending I'd dreamed of when I first held Daniel as a baby, but it was an ending I could live with. An ending that felt, finally, like the truth. If your child ever erased you for comfort or pride, would you forgive them or let silence be your answer? I used to think forgiveness was always the right choice, always the healing choice. But I've learned that some betrayals are so fundamental, so complete, that forgiveness becomes another form of denial. Some truths are too powerful to stay buried, even when acknowledging them costs us everything we thought we wanted. The silence I chose wasn't punishment, it was protection. Protection for both of us from a relationship that had become toxic, from love that had been poisoned by lies and manipulation and shame. Daniel made his choice when he decided I was worth more dead than alive. I made mine when I decided that my truth was worth more than his comfort. Some graves are meant to stay empty. Some resurrections are permanent. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is to stop loving someone who has made it clear that your love is a burden they'd rather not carry. Tell me in the comments, when is silence the most powerful response to betrayal? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, because some truths are too powerful to stay buried, even when telling them changes everything.